Hello there, everyone. My name is Kevin O'Leary. I'm the chair of the Student Affairs Committee for Division 19. I'm particularly excited about our webinar and our discussion tonight. We have right now we have two of some of my favorite people in the division, and Nate Ainspan will be joining us soon. We have Captain Scott Johnson, U.S. Navy, and Eric Surface joining us for our conversation about leadership this evening. Um, I believe that the plan will be to have each one of them kind of give a brief talk, kind of about their leadership style, how it applies out in their field, clinical and research and consulting. And then we'll, given that we have a smaller audience today, we can probably do a bit more, um, you know, intensive Q&A, and we can, kind of make this into more of a discussion than we would if we had more people, which I think would be great. Um, if Captain Johnson, if you'd like to be the first one to start us off this evening.
Well, hello everyone. Yes, this is Captain Scott Johnson. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about this, very, very important issue. Of leadership. Obviously, as a naval officer myself, this has been an issue that I've dealt with, throughout my 23 years in the Navy, and it's something that we need to, I think, focus on for newer people into the career, and certainly if you're going to go into the active duty force, leadership is very, very important. It was a hard lesson for me to learn, but actually in the military, there's almost an assumption that you're a stellar psychologist, and that's really just the first step. And if you really want to get promoted and retain in the profession, you really need to display that you are a good leader. And really, getting up to '04, particularly '05 and '06, you really need to display significant levels of leadership. So what I thought I'd do was is talk a little bit about kind of some of the general kind of fundamentals lessons that I've kind of learned over my career, and then depending on how much time we want to dive into it, I have a couple uh, different kind of theoretical underpinnings that have kind of helped guide me. So I thought I might speak about those if we have time. Mine's a little bit more experiential. I don't know if Eric, did you actually prepare something more academic? And I wonder if that would that be a better place to start, or should I go ahead with kind of my my thoughts?
Go ahead with your experiential. I can talk more about the academic theories of leadership, but because Nate said that's not really what he wanted, I didn't prepare anything formal on that, but I can cover the major ones if people are interested.
Okay. Well, again, yeah, we have a nice small audience. I see we have like three participants, and then the coordinators. So hopefully we'll get in some Q&A. Is there a way to show? I guess we can use that raised hand. Is that if somebody has a question, and we can certainly get into a dialogue about this stuff. But um, yeah, talking about some of just the general kind of lessons that I've learned as I was just kind of thinking about this, and some of this is going to be pretty obvious, but I think it's worth talking about. And certainly, being in the Navy for 23 years, I've learned from some great things from some really good leaders, and I've learned some things that I don't want to do from very poor leaders. So, and I would encourage all you to kind of learn your own style as you're going through your career and talking to people and seeing how different leaders go. And I think there is a goodness of fit. I mean, some leadership styles just don't work for some people and do for others. And what I'll talk about is kind of what's worked for me along my career. So I'll just run through a little bit of list that I had here. And again, some of these may be pretty obvious, but I think it's worth speaking about. For me at the core, I think the best leader is a person that just cares for their people. And so I've really helped this guy that is that, no matter how many people I'm leading or, concerned about or caring about, is I want to make sure that they understand that, and that I get out there, I learn about them, talk with them, and really show that I do care about who they are as a person beyond just the mission that we have to accomplish. One thing I also do is I assume that people are doing the right thing. And this seems like it should be really simple, but I've seen many flag officers and high ranked individuals break this rule of leadership all the time, where they'll hear something about what somebody did that was kind of negative, and they'll assume that it's correct, and they'll go to that person with a kind of accusatory style and say, "Why is this happening?" Instead of coming in and saying, "I heard this thing. Can you talk to me about what's going on?" And it's just this basic assumption that really I think you should just assume people are doing the right thing and are good people, and kind of approach people with that. In that approach, I think is a much positive leadership style than coming in more accusative, which will get a very defensive reaction. One thing I think is really important about leadership is to lead both up and down the chain. I think some people kind of miss this important part. Certainly when I've led organizations, I got to make sure I'm leading down the chain, that people understand that you have people that you have to lead. But everybody has a boss, unless you're the president. Everybody's got a boss. And so kind of managing that and leading up the chain about getting the things that you want to accomplish done is something to keep in mind as well. Communication obviously is a very, very important thing for good leaders. I've often struggled with this in leadership positions about how much to communicate and how much to share with my staff. And as I've gotten more and more senior, I've kind of been defaulting more and more to being transparent. I think people really appreciate the fact if you just kind of can be honest, forthcoming, and share virtually everything that you can. Of course, there's some things you can't share, but share as much information as you can. I think people appreciate that, feel part of the team, and helps you start to develop a sense of trust. And trust, of course, is an important thing. Your people need to be able to trust you. And I know certainly when I was in combat situations and leading people in that more life-threatening situations, trust becomes a very, very crucial issue that you need to help establish within the people that you're leading. I also believe that empowerment is really crucial for leadership. You look good when your people are doing great things, and you really want to empower them to do all the great things that they can do, and certainly not minimize or infantilize what people are doing. But empowerment, I think, is a very important thing. When you think about behavior theory, I think obviously rewarding the team, giving lots of positive feedback. Again, it's amazing how many senior leaders kind of forget this idea that the best way to get people to behave the way you want them is to reward positive behavior instead of consequenting negative behavior. The whole idea of praise in public and punish in private is an important thing that we see broken all the time. But leaders, one person will mess up in a unit and they punish the entire unit. That doesn't go very far and makes a lot of disgruntled people. But if you got something that your team does well, certainly praise that in a public forum is very helpful, and I think ultimately gets the team going in the direction you want them to be. Those are some kind of basic thoughts that I had. Again, I can talk about these two specific mnemonics that I've used, but that was kind of my general intro. I wonder if we should see if there's any questions or comments at this point.
Do any of you have any questions at this point?
Well, hi, this is Nathan Ainstan. Am I patched in? Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, great, thanks.
Well, welcome, Nate. So do we want to mix things up and have Eric talk for a little bit, or should I go into these two other little things I wanted to share?
You can keep on going.
Go ahead.
Okay. As I've gone through, again, 23 years in the Navy, they send us to these leadership trainings all the time, and for most of the time, it's interesting, and you do the Myers-Briggs and all this different stuff, and it's kind of fun, but none of it's really stuck with me. But there's two things that have really kind of stuck with me. One is talking about engineered leadership. Kenneth Blanchard has worked on this idea of engineered leadership, which has really helped guide me. And sorry, I should have kind of sent some of these graphs ahead of time, but I'll try to as best I can to describe them. But the general idea is that you can't be one type of leader for all type of people that you're leading, and that you really need to figure out kind of where people are and then lead them at their level. And that people's engagement in any organization is kind of developing over time. And both these mnemonics have a kind of just a 2x2 grid with 4 different compartments. And Blanchard talks about how initially when people come into an organization, they are often the enthusiastic beginner. And they have typically kind of these low level of competence but high commitment to the organization. And for these enthusiastic beginners, it's really important to be more directive with them. Giving them, I need you to do this, here's when I need you to do it, here's I need you how to do it. Being more directive with them is very satisfying to them, and is very helps you kind of meet their mission that they're trying to do, is that in that first kind of quadrant. As they develop into the organization, they become sometimes maybe a disillusioned learner, where maybe the competence starts to develop, but their commitment may drop off. And for these individuals, coaching becomes the appropriate kind of leadership style, where you need to kind of coach them using motivational interviewing, kind of getting them more engaged with the organization is very helpful. As they develop into the organization, they become the energetic contributor, where their competence is now getting high, and they have variable commitment. So they may be really engaged in some things, but not in others. And for them, a more supportive leadership style is very helpful for them to kind of bring them to the next level. And then finally, our ultimate goal for all of our people that work in our organizations is to be the peak performer. And when you get to the peak performer, they're really highly competent, highly motivated. And for those individuals, really the leadership style then is delegating. So realizing that for them, you just need to set those parameters. I need you to kind of go with this project. Here's the basic vision, and then let them run with it and kind of get out of their way. And so as leaders kind of move through the 4 types of leadership styles, based on where the individual is, really can pay for have a big bang as you as the leader. Really being able to understand where the person is within your organization, and then leading them in the way that they need to be led. And I found this very, very helpful, because if you mismatch this, if you have someone that comes in, they're brand new in the organization, and you start using maybe a delegating style with them and say, hey, I need you to go develop this program, and you let them run, well, it's going to be a disaster. Because they need that higher level of instruction and the who's and where's. But if you try to overmanage a person who is a peak performer, then you're going to get that, oh my gosh, my boss is just a big old micromanager. So I think looking at what type of leader you need to be has been very helpful for me as I've gone through my career. So that's the first mnemonic. The second one I look at is an issue of leadership focus. And this is something that, particularly as you get higher up in an organization, into the more of the management and leadership, looking at where you're going to focus your energy becomes really crucial, because where you focus your energy is where your people are going to focus your energy, and that's really going to impact how successful your mission is. So if you can imagine this, this 2x2 grid where the x-axis is urgency, how urgent a particular task is, and the y-axis is how important that task is, you then break into 4 different quadrants. And so down in the bottom left, where you have the low importance, low urgency, these obviously tasks are things you really want to try to avoid. These are going to be a waste of your time. And as a leader, to be able to identify something that is indeed low importance, low urgency, and not focusing on it is really going to help you, your people, and your mission. We may think that this would be like online training. It may seem like within this quadrant, but I know sometimes we have to do that. But those kind of low urgency, low importance things where you really don't want to focus your or your people's time on. On the other extreme, things that are highly important, highly urgent, this is where people tend to spend most of their time as they need to. These are things that must be taken care of. They're urgent and they're important. You need to kind of find out, delineate, what those specific tasks are, how you're going to solve that, and get that mission done. The other 2 tasks, the other 2 quadrants are very interesting. So if you have the low importance but high urgency, and this is what I find as I've gotten higher up in organizations, that unfortunately some people spend a lot of time in this quadrant. That again is low importance but high urgency. If anybody's worked in headquarters elements, so certainly the Bureau of Medicine and Surgery, hopefully nobody's online here, hopefully the Surgeon General isn't tapping into this, but sometimes when the tasker comes through, some congressman says something, or someone reads some article in the New York Times, boom, people go on fire about this thing is super, super urgent. But when you really look at it, it's really not that important. And I think as leaders, we really need to kind of identify, are we spending time in a quadrant where things may seem urgent, but they're really not that important, and trying to focus us away from that area. The final quadrant is, yes.
This is Nathan. When I took that class about the quadrants, one thing that I realized, and we shared in the class, is that last quadrant of urgent but not important. Doing those are quick hits, and when you do it, it's like an endorphin, because hey, this is critical, this is important, this is a crisis, we're done, and it really does feel good doing it. But in the big picture, you're not really moving your career or the organization along, so it becomes almost like a drug. And if you
What
keep doing a lot of these, you'll feel good, but you may not be going moving forward as you might want to.
Well, thank you for that, Nate, because that's so true. Because you get people in like these larger organizations, and they seem to feed on it and feel like they're really doing stuff. But anybody that has a little bit of perspective or kind of pulls back and looks at it, it's like, what are they really getting accomplished? So you're absolutely right. And then the last quadrant I think is really important that we sometimes miss is this idea of when things are important but not urgent. And so here as a leader, it's important to spend time in this quadrant, but it's easy to neglect it because the more urgent issues are kind of draw your attention away. And this is really the quadrant that really gets into strategic thinking. And so if you're a leader, you need to be thinking strategically and not get caught up in the urgency of the day. So thinking about really what is important, even though it may not be urgent. How am I going to create a vision? How are we going to develop a strategic plan that's going to guide us in the future as you go forward? All these kinds of issues I think are really important to kind of look at as a leader to make sure you are thinking strategically. And so those are a couple of things, strategic leadership and the leadership focus I think are kind of interesting and helpful tools to be thinking about as you're developing in your own leadership. So that kind of completes my initial comments.
Thank you. We appreciate that. I think that mnemonic is great in those. I've used another theory that's pretty similar for supervision that has a similar kind of graph that it uses, and it's real easy to kind of keep that in mind. I think we have our first question here, which I think Captain Johnson was kind of specific to what you're talking about, but it's specifically around how do you suggest kind of buffering against burnout in those that you're leading and trying to keep them in that kind of peak performance or functioning at their highest ability?
Well, that's a great question. Certainly, there's been lots of great research. Maslow developed a particular scale looking at burnout. We try to look at burnout. We actually did a focus of Navy clinical psychologists looking at burnout. And what was interesting is that we did find high levels of exhaustion, using Maslow's burnout scale, but actually high levels of satisfaction. So even though people are feeling exhausted, they did not feel they were depersonalizing with their patients, and they did have high levels of actually satisfaction. So it's something to kind of keep managing all the time. I think I'd go back to the idea of that engineered leadership. If you want to decrease someone's burnout, you got to keep them sufficiently engaged in what's going on, making sure that you're communicating with them, make sure that they get a sense of your vision, make sure they feel worthy, make sure they're feeling empowered. I mean, kind of flipping all those things, I think, are ways to address those issues of burnout.
I would add my advisor actually looked at this and the work that she did where she'd have weekly polls of people and basically asking what was your pulse. And week after week, she would actually be able to almost predict who was going to burn out. And a lot of it is, it equates it to a roller coaster or a horror movie, is that occasionally we like to have the energy going through us and we like the adrenaline rush. But if you keep it up for too long a period, you can burn out the heart. And in a similar psychological way, it's good to have the occasional rushes, but if it's week after week, as she saw, you're going to be doing some damage. So one thing to be aware of is, to follow up on what you said, Scott, be aware of what your people are going through, and if the pressure is intense, it's on you to find a way to de-escalate it. To just give people the time off, to admit you're going through a rough period. One CEO went through this big bug crash, and he said, if we do this, you get the week off for fun. So make sure, people have time to recharge and aren't constantly on. Over.
Awesome. I'm wondering, Eric or Nate, do you want to be the next one to pick things up?
Eric, do you want to take it?
Sure, I can do that. How's everybody doing this evening? Doing well?
Yeah.
So my name's Eric Surface, and I have a little bit different leadership
background than probably most psychologists that you will ever meet do, from the standpoint that really my first professional job, well, not my first professional job, but my first job in psychology was starting my own consulting practice in industrial and organizational psychology from the ground up. So I have an idea, of what it's like to actually start out, make lots of mistakes, and learn from those mistakes. And I think that's one of my most important lessons of leadership, um, is that as a leader, you've got to be willing to take the risk and make the mistake. And then you've also got to be willing to, when you realize you've made a mistake, make an adjustment. What I always tell people is I try not to make the same mistakes over and over again. I try to make new ones. And I think that's the thing that you have to approach leadership with, because it's exact science. It's one of those things where you have to, as people have said several times, really look at the situation you're in and the people that you're leading and what you're over time. I learned a long time ago that there's certain aspects of management that I don't like to do, and so I try to avoid those. One of the aspects of management that you can't get away from as a leader as you move up in an organization, and I think Scott really kind of talked about this a little bit, is this idea of the strategic aspect of leadership. One of the biggest part of that is setting a vision. And I can tell you right now, someone asked about burnout. I've seen the difference when in an organization, in my organization, when you had a clear vision and people were working towards a clear vision and they were working really hard, and that was sustaining to them, to when there was not a clear vision, and they were working really hard and it was creating burnout. So I think one of the aspects of leadership is really to make sure that you're communicating a consistent vision, and you're signaling to your the people that on your team that these are the things that are going to be consistent. These are the things that, even though the organization is in a state of flux, these are the things that are going to be consistent. These values, this focus, and that's really important to grow. And over the years, I started out being extremely technically competent, and that's what I built my business on, was technical competence and just being able to see solutions to problems, and make them happen using research. And that will get you so far in the leadership game. But when you think about leadership, and this is something that I see play out all the time, there really, if you wanted to think about three areas of competence that most leaders have, there's a technical competence, there's a interpersonal or social competence, and then there's a strategic or vision type of visioning type of competence. And when you start out in your career, and you get your first leadership or management or supervisory position, it's usually because of technical competence. You've trained well on something, you've got a degree, you've demonstrated that you can do the job. Now people are asking you to supervise others because you can do the job. And then you start to realize that you need not just the technical competence, but you need the interpersonal and the social competence. And as you move up in the organization, the idea of having strategic skills and being able to think about it become way more important in communicating a vision. And I know from personal experience over the years, I've run a consulting business now. If we survive another year, I will have been in business for 20 years, in one form or another. And I think kind of the idea over time is, have I not, I've made lots of mistakes. I think one of the mistakes that I made was when we grew. We grew based on technical competence, and I spent 200 and something days a year on the road, and I was focused on projects and not focused enough on people. We had, 30 something people, and I depended on other people to stay behind and do that. And that was a mistake. One of the key things that I think, besides for visioning and setting a consistent message and mission for what, depending on, doesn't matter what type of organization you have a mission, but setting a consistent mission and value structure and focus for your team. Besides that, the other thing, and I think, Scott is right on the money with this, is establishing trust. And part of establishing trust with this is sitting down and communicating with the person and saying to them, I understand where you are in this. Like, I've got one employee who's an amazing employee. She's just remarkable. But she has a hard time with ambiguity. And as we've been going through this transition in our business from a consulting firm to a software company that we're doing right now, there's a lot of ambiguity. So what I've learned is with her, I need to sit down and make sure she's okay and answer her questions apart from everybody else so she feels comfortable about it. So it's this idea of, someone said looking at, what the people who are in your organization, your team need, and helping them to get there. And I think that's one of these things I didn't have that awareness early on in my career of what was going on with the people around me. I was solely focused on the task and doing that at an excellent level. And, what I've learned over time is that if you focus on your people and you make sure you have the right people to begin with, your people will make sure that the task gets done at an excellent level. And because you get to a point where you cannot be responsible, you grow to a point where you just don't have the span of control to control that many projects anymore. You have to get it accomplished through other people. So from my perspective, I've sort of had a journey, through the years in terms of leadership that's been, I think, very useful to me. And, one of the things I think, and this will be my last thought, and I can talk if people have more, want to talk more about different aspects in terms of, entrepreneurship or managing large research projects. Because at one point I was, there were a couple of years where I managed about $4 million worth of applied research projects as the PI. But, one of the things that I really think is important, there are a couple of things that are important to leaders is, you can't take yourself too seriously, and you have to be aware of your limitations and constantly trying to learn. And part of that is, again, establishing trust, mentoring others, communicating vision, and Scott said this before, I totally agree with it, empowering other people to get things done. What I really think about this whole process is that, you have to, if you have the trust of people, they will forgive you when you make mistakes, and they can help you to find your way. So, when I look at, over the years and look at the things that I've learned and things like that, it's pretty humbling to realize what we've been able to get accomplished as such a small organization. And in small organizations, you do a lot of roles. We're very flat. We don't have all these levels of leadership, so I have to do a lot of stuff myself. And I still have the technical leadership role to a large degree on some projects. So I think it's just figuring out what your situation is. And if you talk about theories, I know, Scott talked about a couple of tools for managing, task priorities and things like that. But, leadership theories fall basically into three categories. This idea of trait-based theories, style-based theories, contingency or situational theories, and then there's some hybrid of all the above. My take on leadership in general, and this is what I think about most things in human behavior, is that leadership is just another type of behavior. So it falls back to the Lewin axiom of behavior as a function of the individual and the environment. And I'm very much an interactionist. And so when you think about performance as a leader, there's certain competencies, KSA skills, knowledge skills, and attributes that you need to be a successful leader in certain situations, and that leads to successful performance. And those situations can be very micro, they can be very broad, they happen at different levels. So a lot of times people seek out places where they're successful, or they get promoted into places where they're not successful. And so the biggest challenge you have as a leader is to know your own limitations and know when you're in a position where you either need to make adjustments or you've gotten to a point where you're out of your depth and you don't want to be there anymore. I have a lot of respect. I've seen this a couple of times with engineers and computer science, computer programmers, those kind of people who've been promoted into to management positions, who've gone back to technical positions because they didn't like it, they couldn't handle it, they weren't as successful with it. They would much rather be the technologist. So I think if I'm, kind of the last thing I want to going to say is that if you're a leader, you've got to be able to take some risks, but you have to understand the people that you're leading take those risks with you, and so you need to be very conscious of that. I understand that every day the people who work for me, I'm 100% responsible for their livelihoods, and I need to make sure we protect things for the clients, and we make sure I protect them. And I'm always thinking about the future, not the present. And one of those things is I have a responsibility, and as a leader, we all have responsibility for the people who are on our team. So if anybody has any specific questions or thoughts, I'd be more than happy to engage in that. But that's my upfront kind of, this is my background in leadership.
Thank you, Eric. If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask them in the chat, or you can click the little raise hand button up on the top. Why don't we keep going and see if anyone has any questions?
If I could just ask a quick question. Eric, that was really great. And I just want to comment on one thing you brought up about the idea of risk. And again, it's maybe a different vantage point when you think about risk when you have a private consulting firm and employees that are living off the money. But I look at it from the military perspective, and unfortunately, sometimes we see in the military that sometimes our leaders, as they get more advanced up the chain, that they sometimes become risk averse. And I think that's really unfortunate, because I think we want our leaders to be taking risks, innovating, being agile, trying new things, and sometimes that doesn't happen. So I guess I just encourage people to take some risks, and I think the best innovations, I'm sure, in our country's history has happened from people taking those risks. And unfortunately, I think our system sometimes rewards people that don't take risks, do the safe things, and just don't get in trouble during their tour. But a true leader takes the risks and really jumps into that kind of innovative new areas.
Well, I think that's a great point, Scott. And, I think one of the things that happens at a certain point in an organization that has very clear, progression in terms of succession, like the military does, that people try to game the system, right? And they try to figure out, okay, what's the safe path for me to get my objectives, as opposed to necessarily thinking about what's the most effective thing for the organization, right? Because those two things are not necessarily aligned in every. That's unfortunate. When I think about risk, I think about risk as somebody who's running a business right now being different than someone who's an entrepreneur and starting a business. Because when I started a business, the risk was in not starting the business. In other words, if I waited, would I do this at a point in the future if I was used to making a stable salary, if I had a family, wife and kids, somebody depending on my income. And so I think when you think about, or is it the risk that I would never achieve something that I wanted to achieve? So I think, there's a lot of different ways to kind of conceptualize risk from the individual standpoint and from the organizational standpoint. And sometimes, leadership is about forgetting about your personal risk and doing the right thing for the organization and the people who work in the organization or the client. And sometimes, those things are aligned. And, what we try to strive for, I think, are organizations where, taking calculated risks, will be rewarded, or that if you risk and you learn and you fail, but you learn from it, then that's still rewarded too. And I think a lot of times in organizations that people who take really smart risks and it ultimately doesn't succeed for one reason or another are penalized for taking that risk when, and the lesson they learn from that is I shouldn't take any risks anymore. And in actuality, what you should do is you should decompose the reason why that wasn't a successful, attempt at whatever you were trying to do, and learn that the next time I take a similar risk, I can now learn from that. If you look at people who start businesses, typically most entrepreneurs, start multiple businesses before they have their success, right? And so it's one of those things where, as long as you're thinking about it from the perspective of, I'm going to take a risk, it's calculated risk to achieve an objective. And if it doesn't work out, you learn from it. I think that's great. And I think that's one of the things that smart organizations do is they encourage smart risk taking. I know a lot of organizations in the private sector, they actually have, whole system set up that if you have an idea that's outside the norm of what the organization does, you can get funding to pursue that organization in a kind of an insulated environment, right? Because the funding will give you a little bit of runway to see if it's actually going to play out. So, I think it's a great point about risk, Scott. And I think, a lot of times when we work in more hierarchical or traditional or long-standing organizations with a long-standing culture and policy, they've become less risk averse, even when it's smart risk. I mean, more risk averse, even when it's smart risk.
Thank you both for that. Nate, do you want to have a go at it? We have about 20 minutes left.
Hi, this is Nathan. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay. I can speak from two perspectives. One is a little bit of what I got from the literature, and the other is from my personal experiences. I've been in Department of Defense at headquarters, and I've seen good leadership. I really have benefited from it, and I can speak to it. And then I can also try and give a personal angle of what I've learned about trying to develop those skills. The first thing is there's a big difference between being a manager and being a leader. A lot of these things we hear, but I've had the privilege of really seeing the difference and can appreciate it. It's been said before. I'll be reiterating a bunch of some of what Scott and Eric have said. There may not be much new under the sun, but really, there are specific skills to leading, and it's not just about the corner office. It is really about being able to have the vision of the organization, to get people to do something together as a group, to create a group that's bigger than the sum of its parts. And it's not about the title. You can be a leader from, within the middle of the organization as long as you can get the people to go there. One of the best examples, and you could read the literature on it, is the servant leadership. And I've seen amazing examples of this within DoD. Stephen Bowles, I just went to his retirement ceremony. Many of you probably know him. And I mentioned him as an example, not just a teacher, but as a practitioner of leadership, of servant leadership. And the big thing was, I didn't know about his background until I read the little brochure that listed his bio for his retirement. Because every time that I would talk to him on our different projects, it would always be, Nate, what can I do for you? What do you need? And he was always in the background because it was always the focus of what I was trying to accomplish. And it's a tough skill that I've tried to do, sometimes without success. But if you can do it, it's an amazing skill. And I see that for the Marines, the higher ranking officer doesn't eat until the lower ranking ones do, and he makes sure that they're squared away before he takes after his needs. And that's really, I think, the metaphor for a lot of leadership is, you've got to, and this echoes what's been said before, look after your subordinates to make sure that they're doing okay. I had one boss who realized that, if I had a fight at home, it was going to infect the workplace, so he would make sure we'd go out for coffee and just work to resolve it. And you hear of squad leaders in the military who know, every pet, every spouse of the people under them. And they know that if someone's having problems at home, they won't be able to concentrate on the mission over in Iraq and Afghanistan. So they get to know their people, work with them to find solutions for even the personal issues. Our SCSer just retired. For a while, I was acting for my boss while she was out on maternity leave, and I was grateful that in between her meetings with the White House or dealing with Congress or managing multi-million-dollar budgets, she would make sure at least once a week we'd have the time where she'd bring me in, close the door, and just say, "How you doing? What can I do to help you out?" Realizing, that if I was facing issues, it would impact what she'd be able to do. So you really got to keep looking back to the people, like Eric had mentioned, who are supporting you while you're doing what you're doing, and keep after them. Also, being a leader really involves a lot of the tough calls, especially when it comes to firing somebody or reprimanding someone. I've seen a lot of people who like to get the title, the accoutrements of leadership, but then aren't willing to take on the tough issues. And a lot of times, I'm sorry, you want the big pay, you got to take on the big issues and the tough things, the things that may not be as fun as other things. And, except for certain presidential candidates, most people find firing people to be one of the hardest things to do. Unfortunately, as a leader, that's usually one of the things that's up there. In terms of the research literature, certainly, servant leadership, you can look up. Wikipedia has a good summary of some of the elements of it. One project I'm working on now with the RAND Corporation is actually quantifying and enumerating and getting at, how the military trains. Right now we're looking at infantry in the Army and the Marines, how through professional military education, on-the-job training, the military instills these leadership values. A big part of it is through practice, that you start off with a small squad, maybe 3 or 4 people, and then work your way up and really going out and testing in the field. And this idea of taking risks and making mistakes. The military is big at the after-action reports, the AAR, of, immediately when you've done something, go back, what'd you mess up? What won't you do again? There was a joke once of a man had to report to a CEO that he made a mistake that cost $3 million. And the CEO said, "Okay, get back to work." He said, "You're not going to fire me?" He said, "No, I just spent $3 million training you. I want to get my money's worth." So for those in the military, really you're in an ideal position because the leadership that you're getting is, unsurpassed. And the chance to develop these skills, it's really underappreciated in the military. The people in the military don't realize this because it's like fish or water to a fish. And it's remarkable and appreciated in the civilian world. Of course, there are cultural differences that you'd have to adjust for in communication, but the bulk of what you get in the military, I think, really is transferable. And I can send materials out to the division and to this list on some of the things that we're finding. And then also the Robert Hogan from the Hogan Assessment Group spoke at APA about leadership, and it really was eye-opening. And I've got the PowerPoints. I can see if they can be disseminated widely. What he does is he actually breaks leadership down into competencies, and we'll look at what makes a good leader and what can derail a good leader. And one thing he found that's really interesting is a lot of times a lot of things that could be strengths under certain conditions in the leader, under periods of stress, can actually become overemphasized and then become things that could be detrimental to leadership. So some of these things are someone who's diligent or dutiful. Those are great traits, but under certain stressful situations, they can become overwhelming and can actually work against you. And if you're interested in developing your leadership capability, you can have certified consultants administer the Hogan assessment. I had it done to myself, and it's really eye-opening to see what kinds of things you thought could be positive traits that in stressful situations could work against you. And I think I've had problems in some of my previous positions because these things under stressful situations really emerged and turned people off. And it's also very interesting that a lot of the big leaders that are out there are actually high in these negative traits, yet we still see them as great leaders. Like one negative trait is someone who's easily excitable and becomes erratic. think Steve Jobs, who has done amazing things, but also has these negative things. Reserved, think Barack Obama. And there's also looking at some of the literature that's out there, particularly in the private sector. A lot of times people become leaders because they politic well and they're able to network up to a job, and they may not possess these competencies, and it can become extremely detrimental to the success of the company, because we've heard the old phrase, people join companies and then leave bad bosses. So you think of all these managers and leaders who may not have the right skills getting into positions above them. And I think I've heard from one or two people where this may have happened in the military, that they get into these positions and it can be damaging to the company. It can be damaging to individuals. If you think about what stress does to people's health, and it could lead to an early death if extreme enough. It could drive people away. But you never really can rein in a bad leader once they get too much power. So the idea of being able to understand leaders and working with them beneath a bad leader to control or to anticipate them and try and minimize the damage they would do. This comes up in 7 Habits of Effective People, and how to try and cope with that and effectively listen. Can be crucial to your career and to your organizations. I can stop there and take questions. We can engage discussions.
Okay.
Hey Nate, I just want to kind of reinforce what you said about the Hogan. There's been a lot of work on what they call the dark side of leadership, and a lot of it is that, as you were describing, the kind of the fit with the situation or the tasks, and that in some cases the traits that are beneficial in some situations are detrimental in others. And I think one of the things that's really key as a leader is you need to have a level of self-awareness and a level of situational awareness, and try to adjust your approach based on that. And the other thing you said that I thought was really just so true is this, some of the toughest things, tough calls, right, as leaders. The toughest thing I ever had to do was after the sequester. We knew we were going to lose for the next fiscal year. We knew we were going to lose a large percentage of our government contracted money. And we had told people for months and months it was coming. We said, we kept them. We were very transparent about it. We were there. And then we got to the point where we realized what the renewal or the option year was going to be for our contract. And we ended up having to lay off 2/3 of our researchers that the year happened, and that was extremely painful. And although I think we handled it in terms of a best practice way about being transparent and having a group announcement and then talking to everybody individually and having severance packages and support and allowing people to say goodbye, and we had kind of a celebration of their accomplishments at the organization, although it was kind of, I wouldn't use the word celebration, but it was definitely a recognition of their accomplishments. It was very painful, and it was very painful for everybody, and to see how different people reacted to that, is just a course in human nature or human behavior, because you had people who totally went off the rails and engaged in maladaptive behavior to us, their coworkers, to everybody. And then you had people who, it would just amaze me, this one guy, and I wrote him a great letter of recommendation. He's endeared to me forever, because he was like, there 10 hours a day, 12 hours a day, what can I do to transition my work? What can I do? What can I do this? And he was just nice, and he understood, and all this other stuff. And he was just, it made me regret that we had to lay him off. And I think that's the thing, as a leader, you have to make tough decisions. And sometimes you may, and some of the people maybe that we kept, we should have made some different decisions, but you don't know the outcome of that into hindsight. So the best thing you can do is learn from it. And I'll tell you that I have no problem letting go of somebody who's negligent. someone who harasses a coworker, someone who steals, lies, things. We've over 20 years, we've had somewhere about 300 people working for us over that period of time, including interns and things like that. But it's the toughest thing I ever had to do was to lay people off because we didn't have work for them and they were good people. And so those are things that really color your judgment as a leader. And at that point in time, I had a business partner who I had started the business with, and it got to a point where, I think that affected him profoundly in a different way than it affected me. And he just sort of decided he couldn't, didn't want to do this anymore. And so I ended up buying him out last year of the business. But I think that's the thing when you're dealing with leadership, you have to remember that we're all human beings and we all react in different ways. And so, having some empathy and some sympathy and compassion as you go through and you do things and trying to do the right thing even under a difficult situation. I mean, there was no real right answer. There's no answer for us to be able to keep all those people. And so to do the best that you could under a difficult situation is really what I think the essence of being a leader is. So thanks for bringing that up, Nate.
If I can add to that, to mention another boss, I mean, there is the interpersonal angle that I think is critical for most leaders. I mean, you could be sociopathic, you think Bill Gates or something, but that I think is the exception. I had one. Well, it was, I was talking to my wife that my son was sick and we were trying to figure out logistics. And my boss came over into my cube, overheard me and said, "Nate, hang up the phone, please." I'm like, "Oh crap, am I in trouble or something?" He said, "Nate, I just heard what's going on. Go get your son. Go take care of him if you can. Tell to work tonight, but take care of him." I'm like, "But what about this project?" He's like, "I've got it. Go take care of your son." When you look at the research of today, particularly the high-tech jobs that were not really on production lines, so much of the specific job is based on internal motivation. That really you really have to have motivated employees, or else things are just not going to get done effectively, efficiently. And so much of the motivation is just based on the soft, squishy stuff. And the idea of being empathetic to them, to communicating, is becoming just more and more important. You can't just bully people into doing, they can do the bare minimum of their job. But a motivated workforce that does, the OCB's organizational citizenship behaviors and going the extra mile, the only way you'll really get that is to be a good leader that can just, tap into these people, understand them, understand what motivates each individual, and then just constantly, thinking about them, going back to it, and not letting that slip. Over.
If anyone else has any questions, we do have a few minutes left. Otherwise, I have a few that I can ask. All right. I know that one of the questions that's come to my mind as someone kind of coming into the field new, and thinking about, at what point am I going to reach that kind of being promoted to my level of incompetence, and how to navigate that as of the years. And I'm wondering if anyone has any thoughts or experiences around times where you've run into that kind of, you're no longer, as you said, you're no longer being required to kind of do this specific technical or skill-based ability, and now you're being asked to kind of make this larger step, or kind of use these different skills as you become a higher level leader.
Well, I can speak to that briefly within the military setting. And again, I think this speaks to a little bit of goodness of fit. I think some people are more leadership averse, and some are looking for that. If you want that additional leadership and being jumped into that, the military is a great place. Because I would say, how soon are you going to get into that kind of situation? I think the day you go to your first duty station. So if you come in through an internship and then you go off to your first duty station, from day one, you're going to be thrusted into leadership positions that are going to really test that comfort zone. And right from the very beginning, you're going to have to feel your way through that and figure it out. I think there's some inherent qualities that people bring forward, but then the beauty of the military is that there's lots and lots of people there to support you. So to immediately reach out, get mentors, find people, ask a lot of questions, make all the mistakes, as people are talking about, learn from your mistakes and grow. But you're quickly going to feel like you're out there kind of treading new ground, and that hopefully will be seen as an exciting new adventure.
And I would say, this is Nathan, I don't know if it comes at a specific point, and as Scott said, you can always be on the lookout, to make sure if you're, to not go for a promotion that might exceed. One thing we're finding with the research we're doing for the veterans going into civilian jobs is there's a difference between potential and then being, like someone may have the potential to be promoted to become a manager, but they may need to put in 6 months or so to really get the feel for it. I think the military is cognizant of that as well and tries to move people, when they both have the potential and the ability. I know in the private sector, you're seeing companies that are realizing that not all the best talented people are set to become managers or leaders. It used to be, you did well at job X, you became manager of X department, and that could usually lead to some problems. So they may have, like, an IT company may have, you can become a programmer, then an advanced programmer, then a senior programmer, and never have to deal with managing a department or people, because you may excel in computer skills but not, interacting and dealing with people. So, you could be, if you're lucky and can be in an organization like that and want to progress your career up but don't think you could do well with managing the people, that can be an option. And even I've seen in the government, they actually have SES jobs that are just focused on like research. I think they're called SL. So you can really be, at the pinnacle, the big knowledge that, you're not managing people, you're, a senior researcher.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of, just to reinforce what Nate's saying, is I've seen in the private sector a lot of organizations that have created technical paths where people can, continue to move ahead in their career. And that's really important, by the way, because a lot of people feel like upward movement, if they're not getting in an organization, they go on to the next organization, can move ahead in their career in terms of their technical domain, or their necessarily having to go into the management track or into the leadership track to do that. And Kevin, you had mentioned that this idea of promoting the Peter principle, promoting yourself to your highest level of incompetence, right? Or the idea there, though, is I think when we all take on new leadership position, if we're honest with ourselves, there tend to be things we all can work on, learn, improve. And a lot of people don't have that self-knowledge. I've seen over the years of working with leaders. They don't, if you look at 360 degree assessment, a lot of times one of the most powerful reports that you get in a 360 is the blind spot report. How you see yourself in terms of your competencies versus how other people see yourself or see you in terms of that. And, it can be a very powerful tool. But I've also seen in doing feedback with people that some people just discount it because, that's it doesn't fit with it creates that cognitive dissonance. And so rather than use that as an energy to change and to improve and get better, they would rather just believe that they're right. And so I think the idea is, as a leader, as long as, again, you're self-aware and you're willing to accept, and try to make better the areas where you need development in, and you seek out that information, then you're going to continue to move forward in your career. There may be points when you're in a new position where you need more work than you do at others, but I think the idea is just to continue to address that and to try to get better. I constantly face that challenge all the time in terms of trying to learn more about this transition into a much different type of company, and thinking about it, did I make the right decision, you know and what are the implications here, what can I learn from other people, how can I bring other people in to help me, so I think as a leader you get this idea. So I think Scott mentioned it, the idea of delegating, and understanding where your expertise and your focus needs to lie, and bringing other people in to supplement that. I think that's a strong strategy in terms of being a successful leader.
Uh, if I can speak to the question that came up in terms of getting leadership experience, one thing that I found to be very helpful is nonprofit groups, volunteer staffed organizations, because they're, it could be, your house of worship, some local organization. I've been on theater boards. Since I'm not subtle, that would include Division 19. But as volunteer staffed organizations, they really don't have the people. And if you, open yourself up, volunteer for them, but more importantly, like deliver what you promised, you'll stand out. I mean, I've seen that in my experiences. So many people on so many boards that I've been with don't deliver. They'll be happy to complain about something, but someone who actually will say like, "Hey, I have a great idea, and I'll take this on and see it to completion," you will be noticed. You will get free leadership experience. It'll be a smaller sandbox where if you mess up, the stakes won't be as high. But there are wonderful opportunities, and that can be this division as well. And soon, you will get increasing responsibilities, and these can be used in your resume. They certainly be directly, transferable, and you can definitely include them in your resume. That will be used for other paid positions as well. And definitely mentoring. I've been extremely lucky that I met my mentor about 15 years ago, who's just skyrocketed my career. And I recommend, don't be bashful. Be willing to, put out a request if someone's doing something interesting. This gets into the informational interviewing from like, what color is your parachute? You can cold email somebody and just say, what you're doing is interesting. I'd like, if possible, get a few minutes to speak with you. And reach out, ask for advice, be grateful for it, remember to thank people, and then in turn, help out others as you make your way up.
We are a little bit over, and so I want to make sure that if any of our presenters or our participants have any questions or final words, they get a chance to do so.
I just want to thank you for the opportunity and getting us together. Not sure. Hopefully, we had 2 people participate. Hopefully, I don't know what's going on with the larger numbers, but I think it's a great opportunity to get together. And certainly, if you're thinking about a career in the military, leadership and thinking about leadership is an important topic. So glad we spent some time talking about it today.
And thank you for organizing this. And I can attest to being a civilian at DoD that they do take, besides in the uniform side, they take leadership development very seriously. And I really cannot say enough about the experiences, the exposure I got.
I can agree. I definitely agree with both Scott and Nate that this was a great opportunity to talk to people. Thanks for organizing this, to the Student Affairs Committee, and I want to also thank you for your leadership that you provide within Division 19 and for the Division 19 students, because I am constantly impressed and amazed at all the things that you do. In addition to being students, and that you've really taken responsibility and taken on a lot as leaders, and the division definitely appreciates that. The one thing that I do think about this that's been fun for me is, I have a great amount of respect for both Scott and Nate, having worked with them on Division 19 XCOM, and it's just sort of fun to get together and talk about things that aren't, the administrative business of the association or the Hoffman report. So, this was a good opportunity to do that, and I appreciate that. And, thanks a lot.
Well, I know we really appreciate all three of you taking your time to I think this is probably one of my favorite webinars that we've done so far, and I'm really glad that we were able to record it and we'll be able to put it online. And I think this is something that will be a significant benefit for our students and our members for a long time. So we definitely appreciate all three of you being here and being willing to talk about us and kind of showing that these conversations are a lot of fun. So, again, we really appreciate it.
And Kevin, can you all